The winds pick up, the temperature plummets, and under the cover of darkness, a group of men board aging twin-engine bombers. They are young, audacious, and untested. What they are about to attempt has never been tried before. Their mission? To parachute deep behind enemy lines, sabotaging key Axis airfields, and to strike a crippling blow against Rommel's desert war machine. Their unit? A brand new formation, so secret and unproven that many in British High Command doubt that it will survive the month. And what of their leader? A charismatic aristocrat, recently commissioned and barely healed from a parachuting injury. He was just brimming with reckless confidence. Sir Archibald David Stirling. Today, the SAS is a global icon, whispered about in the shadows of counter-terrorism operations, feared by enemies on battlefields across the world, and admired for its deadly efficiency. The SAS has become a symbol of elite special forces. Their motto, "Who dares wins," is synonymous with daring raids, surgical precision, and ruthless adaptability. But few people know that the SAS's very first mission nearly destroyed it before it had even begun. This is the story of Operation Squatter, the first ever mission of the Special Air Service. It is a story of ambition and disaster, of a brilliant plan undone by nature, and of a catastrophic failure that would forge one of the world's most elite military units. Welcome to Wars of the World. In the brutal Desert War of North Africa, 1941, the British Army was in trouble. Facing Rommel's experienced Afrika Korps and their Italian allies, the British 8th Army was struggling to hold the line across Libya and Egypt. Conventional tactics, reliant on large troop movements and armoured assaults, were proving costly and often ineffective in the vast open desert. It was in this environment that a tall, aristocratic Scottish officer named David Stirling began dreaming of something radical. A lieutenant in the Scots Guard, Stirling was, by many accounts, an unconventional figure, a man who combined charm with a stubborn refusal to accept military orthodoxy. Being wounded during a parachute training accident, Stirling had time to reflect. He concluded that small, highly trained units could achieve more behind enemy lines than entire divisions could on the front. His idea was simple but revolutionary. Parachute in small teams, infiltrate enemy airfields, and blow up planes, fuel dumps, and supplies, and then to vanish into the desert. At the time, the British already had a secret unit called L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade, but this was largely a deception, created to fool Axis intelligence into believing that the airborne threat was larger than it actually was. Stirling saw the opportunity to turn this deception into a real, functioning force. Stirling later said in his own words, quote, "The principle behind our method was to concentrate, using a few men and hitting a few chosen targets. Our raiding parties were like a surgical knife rather than a bludgeon." End quote. To make his vision a reality, Stirling bypassed all of the usual channels. Famously, he walked straight into Middle East HQ in Cairo, literally sneaking past the guards, to pitch his plan directly to General Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief. Against all expectations, Auchinleck agreed, giving Stirling permission to recruit and train a force of volunteers. These volunteers came from all corners of the British and Commonwealth forces. Tough, independent-minded soldiers who craved action and were willing to risk everything. They were trained in parachuting, explosives, desert survival and sabotage, pushed to the limit to forge an elite band. Historian Ben McIntyre, in his book SAS Rogue Heroes, describes the formation of the SAS as, quote, "a unit born of rebellion, created by misfits, risk-takers, and men who had no patience for military routine. Their ethos was simplicity, speed, and surprise." End quote. The challenges they faced were enormous. Desert conditions were unforgiving, supplies were scarce, and their equipment was often improvised. Yet Stirling's vision gave the men a sense of purpose, a chance to strike back in a theatre where the British had often been on the defensive. By late 1941, L Detachment was ready, this time for real. Their first test would be Operation Squatter, a mission that would push these new desert raiders to breaking point. By late 1941, David Stirling's newly formed L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade was ready for action. Having trained in the unforgiving Libyan desert, Stirling and his men were eager to prove themselves. This opportunity came in the form of an audacious mission, Operation Squatter. The goal was simple in theory, but extraordinarily risky in execution. The Axis powers had established a chain of critical airfields across Libya, providing both the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica with launch points for strikes against British positions. If the SAS could infiltrate these airfields and destroy the parked aircraft, it would deliver a crippling blow to Axis air power and give the British 8th Army a much-needed advantage. Stirling's plan was to use a cover of darkness to parachute his men in, attacking a series of enemy airfields including Gazala and Timimi. For this mission, the element of surprise would be everything. Following the raids, the men would then rendezvous with the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG, an elite reconnaissance unit experienced in navigating the desert, who would then extract them and return them safely to British lines. It was an ambitious, high-stakes plan, designed to showcase the SAS's capabilities. But even at this early stage, there were worrying signs. Ben McIntyre again notes in his book, quote, "The operation was hastily arranged, reliant on a new and untested concept, using men who were brave but largely untried in the field." End quote. Stirling was convinced that parachute insertion was the best way to bypass Axis defences, but his men had minimal jump experience, and the desert was a notoriously unforgiving drop zone. The weather too was a constant wildcard. In a later account, one SAS veteran described their pre-mission mood as, quote, "We were young, cocky, and we thought we were invincible. There was no thought of failure, only excitement." End quote. Preparation focused on stealth and demolition. The men were equipped with Lewis bombs, specially designed explosives developed by Lieutenant Jock Lewis, Stirling's deputy and co-founder of the SAS. These compact, highly effective charges could destroy aircraft without making excessive noise. This was critical for avoiding early detection. The plan relied on precision coordinates. Pilots from No. 216 Squadron RAF would fly the SAS men to the drop zones, and the LRDG would be in position to guide any survivors back. Yet time was short, and the operation was ultimately rushed. There was little time for thorough reconnaissance or rehearsals. Stirling's leadership was characterized by boldness, but also a certain recklessness. As he later recalled, quote, "If you waited for perfect conditions, you'd wait forever. Better to seize the moment." End quote. In Cairo, senior officers had mixed feelings. Some saw Stirling as a visionary, while others viewed him as a loose cannon, endangering valuable men on a wild gamble. But with the war in North Africa hanging in the balance, the British command was willing to take risks. On the night of 16th of November 1941, 65 SAS men boarded their transport planes. Many were nervous, a few were quietly terrified, but most were excited to be part of something historic, the first real test of the SAS in combat. At that moment in time, none of them yet knew that the mission would end in catastrophe. On the night of 16th of November 1941, the men of L Detachment SAS, 65 hand-picked volunteers, gathered at the airstrip in the Libyan desert. Night in the desert was cold and the wind was beginning to rise. The atmosphere amongst the men was a mix of tense anticipation and nervous excitement. Their mission, Operation Squatter, was to mark the SAS's first ever combat mission, parachuting behind enemy lines to destroy Axis aircraft on the airfields at Gazala and Timini. Each man carried explosives, weapons, and minimal personal gear. They were to be flown in by No. 216 Squadron RAF in aging twin-engined Whitley bombers. Then they would parachute in to designated drop zones under the cover of darkness. The weather was already beginning to turn, and some officers quietly worried about the worsening conditions. But Sterling, ever the optimist, was determined to push forwards. Historian Ben McIntyre writes, quote, "Sterling's genius was his audacity, but that same audacity sometimes blinded him to risk." End quote. The aircraft took off, loaded with men, explosives and equipment. But as they approached the drop zones, disaster struck. In Egypt, they would call it a violent Khamsin, a desert sandstorm, that swept across the region with howling winds reaching gale force speeds. Visibility dropped to near zero, aircraft were buffeted wildly in the turbulence, and the carefully planned parachute drop dissolved into chaos. Men were scattered over vast distances, often miles from their intended landing points. Some landed on jagged rocks or sharp desert scrub, injuring themselves on impact. Others lost their kit or were unable to retrieve the containers carrying their explosives. In one account, an SAS veteran recalled, quote, "We hit the ground hard, wind whipped around us. You could barely see your hand in front of your face. Men were yelling in the dark, trying to gather up scattered gear." End quote. The storm didn't just scatter the men, it also destroyed the element of surprise. Axis patrols, alerted by the aircraft overhead, began to search the area. Many of the SAS teams, separated and disoriented, never even reached their targets. But despite this catastrophic start, a handful of raiders did manage to press on. A small group, led by Lieutenant Jock Lewis, co-founder of the SAS, reached an airfield and succeeded in planting charges on a line of Italian aircraft. But overall, the results were minimal. Only a few planes were destroyed, and the cost was staggering. Of the 65 men who set out, only 21 made it back alive. Some were killed outright, either in landing accidents or in skirmishes with Axis patrols, while others were captured and became prisoners of war. Sterling himself only narrowly escaped, thanks to the timely arrival of the long-range desert group, whose jeeps braved the storm to extract as many survivors as they could. Ben McIntyre describes the aftermath, quote, "It was a bloodbath, a near-total failure. The SAS's first operation, rather than being a triumphant demonstration of Special Forces power, had turned into a disaster." End quote. When the survivors eventually limped back to British lines, the mood was grim. They had failed to deliver the promised blow against Axis air power, they had lost over half of their strength, and the concept of small unit desert raiding looked to many in the high command to be deeply questionable. But Sterling was undeterred. He quickly recognized the operation's fatal flaw, the reliance on parachute drops. The storm had exposed just how vulnerable and inflexible airborne insertion could be in the desert environment. Sterling later reflected, quote, "We learned that at night, the desert was no place for a parachute. The land itself became our enemy." End quote. The SAS would then pivot dramatically in their tactics. Sterling abandoned parachuting altogether, and instead formed a new partnership with the LRDG, using jeeps and trucks to insert raiders close to their targets. With these land vehicles, they could move swiftly, strike with precision, and disappear into the desert before the enemy could react. In strict military terms, Operation Squatter was a disaster. It failed to achieve its objectives and cost many brave men their lives. But it also had become a crucible, a trial by fire that refined the SAS's methods and solidified its identity. As historian Sir Michael Howard noted, quote, "It is not success, but adaptation after failure that defines a unit's greatness. Stirling's genius was not that he never failed, but that he learned from a failure faster than anyone else." End quote. The men who survived Operation Squatter became the core of what would soon be recognised as one of the most formidable Special Forces units in the world. Their setbacks were transformed into hard-won lessons. Lessons that would fuel a string of legendary SAS raids in the months and years to come. And so, out of the sands of failure, the SAS was reborn. Not as an airborne unit, but as a mobile strike force that would rewrite the rules of special operations forever. Operation Squatter was, by any quantifiable measure, a complete disaster. Of the 65 men who set out, only 21 of them returned. The remaining were either killed, wounded and left stranded, or captured by Axis forces. Few missions in the North African theatre suffered such catastrophic failure with so little achieved. Only a handful of enemy aircraft were actually destroyed, and the enemy was left alert and watchful. For David Stirling, this was a pivotal moment. He faced skepticism and even ridicule from parts of the British High Command. Some senior officers suggested that the SAS concept itself was flawed, and that Stirling's men were reckless amateurs, wasting their lives on foolhardy schemes. But Stirling saw it differently, not as the death knell of the SAS, but as an invaluable learning experience. In his later reflections, Stirling remarked, quote, "If we had succeeded, we might have kept trying to succeed in that very same way. Failure forced us to rethink everything." End quote. The most obvious lesson was regarding parachute insertion. The storm had exposed the sheer impracticality of parachuting into the desert. The weather, unpredictable at best, made such landings a gamble, and the scattered landings left the teams vulnerable. Stirling swiftly abandoned the parachute model, and instead turned to the long-range desert group, whose mastery of desert navigation offered a new way forward. Rather than dropping in from the air, SAS teams would travel overland by jeep, guided by LRDG patrols, allowing them to approach enemy airfields silently and with greater flexibility. This change marked the real birth of SAS tactics as we now know them. Small, fast-moving and heavily armed units, hitting hard and then vanishing into the desert before the enemy could even respond. Historian Ben McIntyre observes, quote, "It was one of the few Special Forces units in history that was saved not by triumph, but by a swift, intelligent adaptation to failure." End quote. The newly structured SAS would soon redeem itself. Just weeks after Operation Squatter, Stirling's men, now using jeeps, launched a daring raid on Sirte and Agela airfields, destroying over 60 Axis aircraft without losing a single man. These raids proved beyond a doubt that the SAS concept worked, if applied properly. Stirling's men learned to exploit the desert, using its vastness and harshness as a shield rather than an obstacle. Axis forces, no longer able to feel safe even hundreds of kilometers from the front, were forced to divert resources to defend their airfields and supply lines. As one German officer bitterly remarked, quote, "We never knew when the night would bring the desert ghosts." End quote. Operation Squatter was quietly written out of official reports, being overshadowed by their later successes. But among the SAS veterans, it was never forgotten. The men who survived carried the scars, and also the hard-earned lessons into every mission that followed. Mike Morgan in Stirling's Men writes, quote, "The legend of the SAS was not built on easy victories, but on learning from every mistake and refusing to quit." End quote. In the broader history of Special Forces, Operation Squatter stands as a powerful reminder that elite status is not born from perfection, but from resilience. The reputation of the SAS as one of the world's most formidable fighting forces began not with a success, but with a failure, and with leaders and men willing to rebuild, reimagine, and to strike back harder than ever before. On the surface, Operation Squatter was a disastrous failure, a bungled mission that left dozens of brave men either dead or captured, delivering minimal damage to the enemy and casting serious doubt over the viability of Sterling's bold new unit. But history often judges events not just by their immediate results, but by the long-term consequences that they set in motion. For the Special Air Service, the lessons learned in the harsh Libyan desert reshaped its identity and methods. The failure of Squatter forced a radical rethink, pushing the unit away from parachute assaults and towards overland raiding, a transformation that would soon make the SAS one of the most effective and feared special forces in the world. In his book, SAS Rogue Heroes, Ben McIntyre writes, quote, "Without Squatter, there would have been no SAS as we know it. The catastrophe forged the unit's true nature: lean, mobile, ruthless, and adaptable." End quote. In the months following Squatter, Sterling's reinvented SAS launched a series of devastating raids, destroying hundreds of Axis aircraft, sabotaging supply lines, and inflicting psychological havoc on Rommel's forces. These victories were not just tactical successes. They validated the entire concept of special operations warfare: small teams operating deep behind enemy lines, wielding disproportionate impact. Within the SAS itself, Operation Squatter remains an essential part of the regiment's history, a reminder that failure is not final. Many modern SAS veterans point back to those early days in 1941 as the crucible that shaped the regiment's enduring ethos: adaptability, innovation, and unbreaking resilience. As David Sterling himself reflected later in life, quote, "The key to success was never avoiding failure, but in learning faster and striking back harder." End quote. The SAS motto, "Who dares wins," encapsulates this spirit perfectly. It's not the absence of risk or error that defines elite forces, but the willingness to dare boldly, learn relentlessly, and to evolve constantly. Today, the SAS stands as a global symbol of special operations excellence, its reputation built on decades of high-stakes missions from North Africa to the Falklands, Iraq to Afghanistan. But at its core, that reputation traces back to the hard lessons of Operation Squatter, a mission that nearly destroyed the SAS before it had even begun, but instead that became the foundation upon which greatness was built.